the most striking thing really is the timeline here, because it effectively takes to the shredder the defenses that the Bush administration raised after the Abu Ghraib incidents became known. Remember, it talked about rotten apples. It insisted that there was no connection between approval of certain limited techniques by Donald Rumsfeld and the abuses that happened in Bagram and at Abu Ghraib. And this report establishes very clearly that there is a documentary trail from the White House, in fact, as well as from Donald Rumsfeld's office, all the way down to Abu Ghraib and Bagram, that the abusive techniques that were used there, that are acknowledged in the Department of Defense internal investigation, in fact, were authorized at the highest levels. And I think one other thing very, very striking, that is the most intense use of the most abusive practices, especially waterboarding, occurred in the weeks just before the invasion of Iraq. Very clear that there was a press that was led by Cheney and Rumsfeld to get information from these detainees that could be used to justify the invasion of Iraq.
Well, an Al-Qaeda link to Saddam Hussein, for example.
Exactly. A link between Al-Qaeda and Saddam, or evidence of weapons of mass destruction.
So given that we have this paper trail now categorically showing that officials on the record misled everyone, where does that leave the chances of an investigation and possible prosecution?
Well, I think a couple of weeks ago people were ready to write this off, and in fact, just last week, President Obama went to the CIA and made statements suggesting there was going to be no investigation, much less prosecution. And yesterday we saw things very dramatically turn around. Now we're seeing these demands being heightened, and in fact, Senator Carl Levin releasing the report with a very dramatic demand that the Attorney General appoint a special prosecutor. In fact, he says it should be a retired prominent judge or some person of great stature who should probe these questions and make a decision about prosecution. Everybody now is talking about prosecution, not just of mid-level people, but potentially important figures in the White House, potentially even the president and vice president.
Three lines of possible defense have emerged. One from President Obama himself in recent weeks, that this is not the time to look back. There's no point in retribution. Secondly, another defense is, look, this was all happening in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. There was an enormous fear further attacks would take place. It's difficult to second guess the fear that administration officials had, that they needed more information immediately. Thirdly, that actually there was some useful information that came out of these interrogations. Do any of these lines of defense complicate matters as far as the prosecution goes?
Well, I think they're all things that would be taken into account by a prosecutor making a decision whether or not ultimately to bring charges. But none of these things, in fact, are a legally recognizable defense to charges of torture and conspiracy to torture. And in fact, President Obama swore an oath to uphold and enforce the law, as did Attorney General Eric Holder, and I think they've got to take that seriously.